You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 2nd of December 2024 on Monocle Radio.
US President Joe Biden prompts the richly amusing spectacle of Trump world, complaining about nepotism, cronyism and corruption, the prospect of chaos, well, further chaos in France, and are Britain's public services actually getting worse, or are people just complaining about them more? Or why not both? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Terry Stiastny and Simon Brooke will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll meet Turner Prize nominee Pio Abad ahead of the announcement of the award later this week. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Terry Stiastny, political journalist and author, and by Simon Brooke, the journalist and communications consultant. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
As I understand it, well, I know this for a fact because I was pumping you for light introductory banter material in the green room beforehand. You have both been experiencing the culture this week. Terry, what have you been seeing?
I've been catching up on some of the big films, and I think mostly the problem with them is they're too long and they have too many monkeys in them. So I've seen Wicked, which is apparently only Wicked Part 1, even though it's 2 hours, 40 minutes long, and Gladiator, in which nasty things happen to and from baboons. There seem to be, a lot of
I would
monkeys.
love to see that quote on a poster. Too long, too many monkeys, Terry Stiastny.
It's there if someone wants to use it.
Can they have that for nothing?
They can have that for nothing.
Would you, in all good conscience, recommend either film?
I preferred the Gladiator 2, I've got to say. I thought Wicked was something going to cheer me up. And it's only half of the film. It's part 1. It's the origin story of the Wicked Witch of the West. And she's still good by the end of it, which is, a bit odd.
Yeah, see, as has been discussed in different contexts on these programmes before, Simon, I don't really attend the cinema as such because it's where you run up against the non-zero, admittedly minority, but nonetheless unavoidable minority of people who are simply incapable of sitting still and or shutting up for 2 hours.
Yeah, I think it's partly the impact of television and watching screens at home that people forget that when you're watching something, you should be quiet and give it 100% attention. Because, yes, I went to see Conclave, which is the Ray Fiennes film of Robert Harris's book of the same name, which I really enjoyed. But, yeah, it was interesting that there was a bit of a constant commentary going around behind me and in front of me. And also I noticed that when people had to go to the loo, they didn't sort of sneak out. They would march out in front of the screen, throw the door open, and when they'd come back again, throw the door open again. So I really, really enjoyed the film. Totally recommend it. But yeah, I know what you mean about the great British public.
But just finally, as to the clearly important questions, how would you assess it for length and monkey quotient?
Luckily not many. Well, the turtles in it, bizarrely, and obviously millions of cardinals, as you expect. I don't know what the collective noun for cardinals is, but loads of cardinals. The length was just right. I'm a natural editor, so every time I read a book, watch a TV programme, watch a film, whatever, my first reaction is cut that, let's get on with it. But in fact, having read the book, I think this had better pace than the book itself does.
And monkeys?
Yeah, if you're looking for monkeys, you probably need to bring your own.
OK, so your line for the posters on that film would be about the right length, arguably insufficient monkeys.
Yeah, absolutely. 4 out of 10.
OK, well, we will start in the United States, where those of a MAGA bent are presently shaking fists, gnashing teeth, rending garments, etc., at the grotesque impropriety of a US president using his powers to let his idiot son off the hook. Where will it end? Next thing you know, he'll be pardoning his son-in-law's father for tax evasion, witness tampering and blackmailing a relative before appointing him ambassador to France, which, by way of underpinning this devastating satirical point, is something President-elect Donald Trump has literally done. We refer, yes, to the news that President Joe Biden has forestalled the sentence of his son Hunter Biden on gun and tax-related charges by issuing a full and unconditional pardon. Terry, we will turn shortly to the attendant hilarity, but it's fair to say, is it not, that this in and of itself is quite depressing, shabby, bad, and really quite reprehensible behaviour by the outgoing president?
Yes, I think so. I mean, presidents often pardon people you don't think they should pardon. But the way that Joe Biden has done this, he having said in terms, I will not pardon him, and it got quite a lot of credit for actually saying, no, let the process of law take its course, and then to go back on that. And I think he's trying to have it both ways. He's sort of saying, well, as a father and as a president, I'm choosing to pardon him because this has become too political. And, you can't be both in this context. You either pardon him as a president. Most fathers whose sons have done something wrong don't get to pardon them for whatever it is. And, you should be taking the office seriously and not lowering yourself to your rival's level.
Indeed. I mean, Simon, the president may just be in what I believe the young folk refer to as DGAF mode, approaching the end of his presidency. But nonetheless, can we imagine that he would be doing this if Vice President Kamala Harris had won this election?
I don't know. It's difficult to say. I mean, I think certainly there's a feeling that he's a lame duck president. So what? I might as well do that. I mean, I've never been a great fan of Joe Biden's, I have to say. And for me, this is another example of his bad judgment. It was not a good thing to do. As you say, it does make him appear to be as bad as Trump. I think it's been interesting that we've seen very little support for this decision from fellow Democrats. What Kamala Harris thinks about it, I don't know. We'll have to wait for her memoirs, presumably. But the other thing it does is, I think what it makes his supporters do is have to do that 180-degree turn that he's done, as you say, Terry. And it reminds me of a few months ago when he was clearly cognitively challenged, shall we say, and not putting in a good performance at all in debates and his presidential duties. And he was sort of forcing senior Democrats, all his supporters, to say something that was just clearly not true by saying, don't worry, the president is completely up to it or whatever. So I think, I think it's an example of he's on the way out. What the heck? But it really does. I can't imagine there'll be many of his Democrat supporters, colleagues or whatever, who will be very pleased about this decision, even though the Republicans will obviously be delighted.
I mean, we will come to that. But while I'm asking you hilariously leading questions, Terry, is this objectively any worse than Donald Trump during his first term pardoning, for example, the likes of Manafort, Stone, Flynn, Bannon and Papadopoulos, as wretched a rogues gallery as might be imagined?
No, I mean, there's clearly been, abuses of how the process works. And clearly, it's become something that is a political process where you don't just decide to pardon people that you think have been, unjustly convicted on drugs offences. There have been some relatively good potential uses of presidential pardons. But I think one of the interesting things here is that he has also, if you look closely at the wording of this pardon, he's kind of backdated it even further. Mm-hmm. So he's jumped it back to 2014 and also says, including but not limited to the things that he had already been convicted on, like guns and taxes in the Hunter Biden case. So you think, is this literally a get-out-of-jail-free clause for anything else that the incoming administration might want to try and go after Hunter Biden for?
Well, on that thought, Simon, there are those, and you're right to point out that a few Democrats have said that this is not really on. Among them, Colorado Governor Jared Polis, who said it is a bad precedent that could be abused by later presidents, whoever can he mean, and will sadly tarnish Biden's reputation. When you become president, your role is paterfamilias of the nation. Hunter brought the legal trouble he faced on himself, all of which is true. But this concern that this single act of Biden's might somehow embolden President-elect Trump to behave completely monstrously. I mean, it's nonsense, isn't it? I mean, Trump is always just going to do whatever he feels like, and he and his supporters will confect some post hoc justification for it.
Yeah, they will. I mean, I think, Terry, you mentioned that some of the people that Trump has pardoned there, and they are, blatantly broken the law, and have been useful to Trump or whatever. Whereas the way that Biden and his supporters are trying to spin this is it's much more about compassion, about, he goes on sympathy. He's talked about Hunter Biden being 5.5 years dry, sober, doing his best. So he's certainly very much ticking the human box, and I suppose trying to come across as sympathetic rather than just the mafia don who wants to get his buddies out of jail. So I think he's trying to position it in a different way, but that is so often what the Democrats do. They have they go to the electorate with a kind of position or a subtle way of, actually, don't look at it quite like this, look at it like this, and that just doesn't work in politics, as we know.
Well, we will have more on the ramifications of that on tomorrow's shows, but we will move along now to a developing story: political tumult in France, and yes, later in the show, to Catholicism in the Vatican. But seriously, France's government may be on track to implode as soon as tomorrow, after Prime Minister Michel Barnier bounced a social security budget bill past Parliament without consulting MPs. This seems more or less certain to trigger a vote of no confidence, which Barnier's minority government seems highly unlikely to survive. If the vote goes against Barnier, he will likely stay in post as a caretaker until, that's a caretaker prime minister, not a literal caretaker, that would seem unseemly, until President Emmanuel Macron can come up with something else. Terry, this strikes me as having been more or less inevitable from the very second Macron appointed him.
I think he was always in a slightly difficult place, Michel Barnier. It took a while to try and appoint a prime minister who seemed to be vaguely acceptable to all the parties, and he is gradually being pushed back further and further in terms of what he was trying to get through in terms of the budget, whether that's electricity price rises or pensions or which medications are going to be paid for. So the difficulty, and it was quite dramatic this afternoon in watching it. He was speaking, he was getting heckled and booed. You saw the sort of the left-wingers all get up and walk out of the Parliament. And now, he's ending up facing possibly even more than one confidence vote, because everybody seem to want to table their own vote. So you're getting the Le Pen confidence vote and the left-wing one, and up to about 3, I think, at the last count. So although he said he wanted to try and force through this budget without a vote, he has kind of brought the whole thing down on himself.
On the subject, though, Simon, of the flouncers on the left to whom Terry alludes, do we have to suspect that what they actually want to do is flounce, that they don't actually really want to govern in any meaningful sense?
Well, that is the problem, isn't it? And obviously, if you look at the other end of the political spectrum, you've got to remember that Macron's whole gamble when he dissolved Parliament was the idea, let's put the National Rally, Le Pen's party, into power, and let's just see them mess it up. They're populist, it won't work, or whatever. I think the real problem for France is that the two extreme political wings look the most powerful now, don't they? And neither of them seem to have any grasp of economics or any, like you say, they don't really care. I think that's the problem. You look at, France's borrowing costs have massively increased. The bond prices bond returns are now similar to Greece, a whole percentage point lower than higher than Germany, for instance. And so the economy really is struggling in many ways. Budget, this 60 billion euros of expenditure cuts is absolutely necessary to keep the French show on the road in this way. But it'll be interesting to see if there is a sort of realignment, whether it turns to be more to the centre and people who could sort of manage the economic problems that France is facing.
Terry, we should talk about the president's options, and I think, like many preparing to go on air in non-French territories this evening and discuss this, I have spent some of the afternoon with my Idiot's Guide to the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. As I understand it, he can call another parliamentary election, but it can't happen until a year after the last one, which will take us through to July. I mean, he could presumably resign, but he doesn't really have to until the next presidential election in 2027. So what does he do? Does he just tell Barnier to stay where you are for another 8 months, even if nobody wants you?
I think that seems to be the option. Basically, you're kind of stuck there unless, Macron suddenly sort of, throws a hissy fit and decides that he's going to call an election. But given, that is even more high risk, obviously, than having done the same thing.
By which you mean a presidential election?
Presidential election. I mean, he could, theoretically resign, and the Senate, I've been looking this up as well, exactly how this works. But he
can't run if he calls another presidential election.
No, he's gone, he's out, and you're basically leaving the way clear for Marine Le Pen or Bardella, or, which it would seem an even even more crazy thing to do. I mean, there have been loads and loads of these censure motions since 1958. There's only been one that's actually passed, which was in 1962. And these things do tend to get through eventually. So, you can just keep trying and going back. There will be some kind of a budget. There will be some kind of a caretaker prime minister, as far as I understand it, in the meantime. And you can just go on trying to get things through. But the trouble is, in the meantime, people are making all sorts of noises like, as Michel Barnier was saying today, the French people won't forgive us for preferring our individual interests over the future of the nation. This is a moment of truth. Valérie Pécresse was saying, it's like trying to drive a car into the wall. Why would you crash things like this? And people just seem to want to do that. They seem to want to say, well, we're not giving way on any of our social benefits, and Macron has been trying for years to try and reform things, but he's getting the resistance now from both sides.
Is this all, Simon, somewhat arguably self-indulgent behaviour at a moment when neighbouring Germany is also having some sort of nervous breakdown? The United States is about to reinstall Trump. It would be reasonably useful at this point for a serious continental power to look like it has its act together.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it? Europe has always been driven by the Franco-German axis, hasn't it? And the problem now is that
I think the Germans are a bit touchy about the use of the word axis. Do carry on.
Engine, some people say, or whatever. But the problem is, as you say, both governments, obviously Scholz in Germany is in huge trouble as well. The opinion polling showing that the majority of people in France, for instance, don't want this austerity budget, and they do actually, by a small majority, want this Barnier government to fall. So it's always been that sort of bitter joke, hasn't it, in Washington about if you pick up the phone to speak to Europe, who do you ring? And it used to be Angela Merkel, of course, but even her star is falling now, isn't it? And so the question is, I mean, certainly when it comes to Ukraine and things, obviously the Nordic states have been strongest there, but of course they're tiny by comparison to France and Germany. So it does, as you say, it does seem particularly difficult if you look at the politics, the economics, that there isn't a strong European leader who can stand up to, or at least negotiate with an incoming Trump administration.
Well, to Ireland now, which has scarcely been unusual this year in holding an election. As has been widely noted, more people have voted this year than in any other in all of human history. Those numbers obviously significantly inflated by the coincidence of American, Indian and European elections. Ireland's election is unusual in that context, however, in that Ireland's voters have not, or at least not quite, directed the incumbents to the door. The two parties which dominated the government, Ireland's traditional duopoly of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, look on track to finish first and second, but may still need help to command a majority in the Dáil, should they wish to continue in coalition. Simon, first of all, Sinn Féin do appear to have gone somewhat backwards. The reason, of course, that Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil formed this grand coalition was to keep Sinn Féin out of government after the last election. Sinn Féin finished rather second in that one, if memory serves. Is that going to be cause for sighs of relief all round, the fact that Sinn Féin might just have limped into third?
I think certainly for the major parties it will do. They've worked very hard to keep Sinn Féin out of this. There have been questions asked about Mary Lou McDonald's leadership, whether how ineffective that has been. Also renewed concerns about the party's connections with terrorist activities. I did think it's quite interesting that exit polls suggest that Sinn Féin has made gains amongst voters in the 25 to 34 age bracket, and this is probably something to do with the housing crisis that Ireland faces. Generally, the economy is booming, hence this support for the incumbents, which of course is very unusual. But since 2015, house prices in the Republic have risen by 92%. So if you're a young person getting on the housing ladder, you're very unhappy, and that's perhaps why you're willing to go with Sinn Féin. But certainly it does seem to be, given the high they've been on the last few years, this is quite a fall.
Given the housing crisis especially, Terry, which is extremely severe in Ireland and, as Simon correctly notes, especially among young people, why is it, do you think, that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael between them have managed to kind of buck this widespread animus, especially towards establishment stitch-ups, because their coalition was the very definition of an establishment stitch-up?
Well, Well, I think it's because they've got a very different economic situation. I mean, looking at just talking about France and then the UK and Germany, where everybody has kind of come in, governments have been saying, look, we've got to cut back. These are going to be hard. We need to fix the infrastructure, but it's going to cost you, essentially. They've been able to go into an election saying, well, look, we're going to have big spending programs. We're going to have tax cuts. What kind of money would you like? How much can we give you here? And, the economy has been very healthy. So I think in that context, and we've seen it, of course, in the US as well, it has been easier for people to say, well, okay, they are going to do something to our benefit, and so we can vote for the same parties back in again.
I mean, is there an argument, perhaps, Simon, that smaller countries, this was something we've talked about in a recent episode of the Foreign Desk about Scandinavian countries attempting to prepare their citizens for crisis, that smaller countries tend to be slightly more trusting of their institutions? The Republic of Ireland, for example, and I looked this up, has about half the registered voters of London.
Yeah, I think it's probably something to do with the size of the population. It's perhaps also something to do with a kind of social consensus as well. You don't perhaps get the diversity in smaller countries that you do in France, Germany, the UK and other countries. So that encourages people to, I suppose, to have more trust, because the government sort of feels nearer to you, doesn't it? If it's, if there are fewer of you looking to the government, there are fewer sort of layers of government between you and the people at the top, then perhaps you do feel more connected to that. And certainly trust, I think, is so important. You look at the political problems in Europe, in the US, in other parts of the world as well. A lack of trust in our political leaders is really serious, and it's getting worse.
Terry, the Republic of Ireland, like a great many countries, believes itself to have a special relationship with the United States. Certainly it did during the presidency of Joe Biden, who is an absolute comedy cartoon Irish-American, despite being, and I did look this up once trying to make exactly this point, precisely half the Irishman I am, for example. And yet, if I made that some sort of cornerstone of my identity, people might think I was having some sort of an episode. But that's obviously about to change, though Trump bangs on a lot about Scotland, less so about Ireland. And Trump's ideas for remaking the global economy as we understand them, and to the extent that he will stick to them, they could affect quite badly, you can imagine, a country like the Republic of Ireland. Apparently 43% of its corporation tax receipts, which are a considerable part of its revenue, come from just 3 US companies. If Trump makes it difficult for the likes of Apple, Microsoft and Pfizer to operate overseas, that's not going to be good.
Well, no, I mean, as Simon Harris said during the election campaign, if those 3 US companies left Ireland, it could cost their economy 10 billion euros in corporation tax. And given that, Trump's nominee for Commerce Secretary is saying it's a nonsense that Ireland of all places, he says, runs a trade surplus at our expense. They are quite worried that, that a lot of this money, a lot of these corporation tax receipts could go. I mean, yes, Trump has, I think, won a golf course and a hotel in Ireland, but that probably isn't the same level of connection, even if he suddenly finds himself, paying himself, more taxes or something. It could be difficult. And the Irish economy is based, a lot on these exports and a lot on having US companies in particular making Ireland their base within Europe, and with the English and the access to the EU. So yeah, it could be a big problem.
Well, here in the UK, a report by the cross-party think tank Demos would appear to underpin the stereotype long cherished by my people, i.e. Australians, of the British, i.e. that they are somewhat prone to complaint. Poms are whinging, the report says, words to that effect anyway, about the state of the UK's public services at increased volume, doubtless in both senses of the word. Gripes about such sectors as benefits, education and the NHS have bolted by a third since 2016, even accounting for a decline during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially around the point at which public services amounted to an instruction to put your feet up and await a delivery of free money. Terry, to what do we attribute this? Are things actually getting worse, do you think?
I think certainly in the last few years, people have felt that things are not working as well. People have felt that they are having to wait longer for healthcare and things like that. And certainly things like the railways, for instance, and people constantly complaining that, you are paying an absolute fortune for your train ticket, and, the likelihood of it getting you to where you need to be at the time that you need to be there is relatively low. And I think particularly where there's money involved, if it's something like that, if you have to, your train is half an hour late and you can fill in a form and get the cost of some of your ticket back, I think people are more inclined to complain. But though I think, the complaints procedure itself, if you're trying to deal with any public service, and actually getting a response and all of that is a whole load of extra work. So I can see why people wouldn't, because you just think, well, will I actually get anywhere?
Simon, do you think it is entirely coincidental that there is a significant overlap between the period in which complaints about public services have increased and the period of the previous Conservative government?
Well, their political opponents would say yes, because the austerity, saving money and stuff. I think the problem is that, I was going to say people, all of us, our expectations have increased, haven't they? I mean, I think if you look at the private sector, of course, immediate deliveries, where exactly when your pizza's coming, you can order anything almost online and get it delivered in a few hours' time. The retailers, service providers are falling over themselves to provide a better service, and I think most people would agree that it is better. The problem is, of course,
have you been reading a lot of Ayn Rand over the weekend as well?
But the problem is, it's a completely different thing. Obviously, ordering a pizza is slightly different from accessing your disability benefits or getting your leg fixed if you've been broken in an accident or something. But when it comes to that general feeling of I want things to happen immediately and to be absolutely perfect and tailored to my needs, then I think the private sector, retail has set this very high bar, and the public sector is running around to meet it. And I think the problem generally is that, of course, as part of a civilised society, and you look at the example you're saying in Ireland, where there's enough money to pay for good public services, we all expect better and better public services. But to what extent do we not appreciate them? Or, I mean, you'd be a brave politician to stand up and say, I know the NHS is good, but you should think yourselves lucky anyway. But I think there's an element of people, that expectation constantly rising, and it's never going to be completely satisfied.
A pet theory I will introduce at this point, Terry, is also the factor of social media's exponential growth in that time for two reasons. One is that it does encourage, main character syndrome for every individual to believe that I am the most important human being alive, and what my particular problems are the most important thing anybody should be thinking about. But of course, they also social media, that is, also makes it vastly more easy for people to raise some sort of rumpus.
It does, and it also makes it easy to get a reaction, because I think the frustrating thing about trying to complain about a public service, if it's, say, the health service, is just not getting a response. And if you complain about, like Simon was saying, your pizza didn't arrive or you got the wrong one, it's really simple. You just click on something on an app and someone gives you your money back straight away and the problem is solved. And
you've amputated the wrong arm.
Yeah, fill in the form here with your remaining hand, and we'll give you some compensation. But I think it's partly that public services haven't kept pace with the way that businesses are working. If you're trying to book a doctor's appointment or whatever, they're gradually dragging the NHS kicking and screaming into being able to book things online and have better better systems like that. But it's just the frustration of having to ring up, trying to find someone to talk to, trying to make things work in a way that we have come to expect in other parts of our lives.
I want to close on personalising this by asking you both the hard and fast question. Simon, first of all, have you participated in this chorus of complaint? Have you teed off on social media? Have you written to your MP? Have you filled in one of those forms with the passive-aggressive sign-off, for all the good this will do me? Regards, Simon.
I sort of don't expect the public services to react to that. I have to say I am an absolute serial complainer when it comes to shops, restaurants, airlines. Yeah, and I've even written articles advising people on how to complain. If you're speaking to a representative, for instance, more in sorrow than in anger, I'm sorry, I know it's not your fault. I've always been a fan of X airline or retailer or a restaurant, but I'm sure you can understand this time I'm very unhappy. So and I've posted stuff. I think that's one of the great things about social media and the internet, isn't it? That we can share these experiences. I'm always reasonable and polite and usually get a good result.
Really? Terry, have you sat down at any point with a blank sheet of paper and the green pen and fired off an email, or you wouldn't fire off an email, would you? You know what I'm trying to say here? Written a letter to your MP?
No, I haven't done that in ages. I mean, luckily, I think I've just managed to
ages.
avoid. Yeah, in ages. No, I don't think I ever have, actually. I don't think I've complained that much. I probably just do it in private and just rant about why things aren't working. But I'm usually one of these people. I don't like to make a fuss.
Well, exactly. That's part of the problem, not part of the solution. Terry Stiasny and Simon Brooke, thank you both for joining us. Finally on today's show, in fact. I was going to say finally on today's shoe, which would be a whole other thing. To be clear, I'm wearing two. We are taking a detour to Manila via the Tate Britain. Pio Abad is an artist whose work about the excesses of former Filipino First Lady Imelda Marcos led him on a journey to uncover other histories of loot and plunder, and that earned him a Turner Prize nomination. Alan Whedon joined Pio at the Tate to find out more.
It is not expensive to be beautiful. It takes only a little effort to be presentable and beautiful.
These are the words of the Philippines' Imelda Marcos, a First Lady turned dictator, not known for her frugality.
As First Lady, I have to practically flaunt love and beauty.
As it turns out, it cost a lot of money to meet Imelda's beauty standards. $10 billion, in fact. That's the figure Imelda and her husband Ferdinand are believed to have embezzled from the Philippine state during their kleptocratic rule. Imelda's lust for luxury was such that even when she and her family were kicked out of the country, she managed to leave with 413 pieces of jewellery, all wrapped in disposable nappies. And one of those jewels lies on the floor of the Tate Britain as we speak. Well, almost.
The exhibition opens with this grey form that some people read as a corpse, some people read as a massive jellyfish or some kind of sea creature that's been moored onto a plinth.
You're hearing from Pio Abad, a Filipino-born artist based out of London.
What it actually is, it's a 3.5 metre concrete reconstruction of a ruby, pearl and diamond bracelet that Imelda Marcos used to own. She tried to smuggle them to Hawaii, where they were given exile by Ronald Reagan. When she arrived, the New York Times headline was, Imelda lands in Hawaii with diamonds and diapers, like stones and shit, basically.
I met Pio recently at the Tate Britain, where he is showing as part of the 2024 Turner Prize, Britain's top award for contemporary art. Tomorrow, Pio, alongside fellow nominees Claudette Johnson, Jasleen Kaur and Elaine Labar, will find out who will be the ultimate winner in a glitzy ceremony.
I hope the meal's really nice. No, obviously it's a big deal, but even just to be nominated and to exhibit alongside 3 incredible artists has been a real honour.
For just over a month now, visitors to the Tate Britain have been able to judge the nominees for themselves, and it's Pio's exhibition, To Those Sitting in Darkness, that opens this year's Turner Prize galleries. It's a space where dark blue walls contrast with light timber floors, which host a selection of reproduced jewels, rare artefacts, drawings and sculptures, like Imelda's bracelet.
And this bracelet very much inhabits what would in, say, the British Museum be a sarcophagus. And so this idea of this loot becoming a body, becoming a corpse, echoes a lot of these other things that I've been interested in, which is the presence of violence and the role of theft in understanding how museum displays work and how to think about museums in the present tense.
The genesis for Pio's Turner exhibition begins at Oxford University, where he was invited to exhibit at the university's Ashmolean Museum, Britain's first public museum, opened in 1683. Its curator, Lena Frisch, first through the archives of the museum open to Pio, but he later got access to the entirety of the university's archives. And for 2 years, Pio trawled through university libraries, museum storerooms and palace gardens to gather stories and objects.
And so the objects that I chose to exhibit initially at the Ashmolean and now at Tate Britain were objects that have been in museum storerooms for centuries, decades, mainly centuries. And so this idea of the exhibition becoming an act of illumination became important, and excavating an archive as vast as Oxford's, it made sense to begin from where I began, to the Philippines. And so I very much view the exhibition as, while rooted in Philippine history, not just limited by it, but actually that becomes like almost like a point to unmoor and explore other stories, other lands, other objects.
Adjacent to the bracelet is one such example, a large drawing titled, "I am singing for a country that can only be born after losing a country." Measuring 180 by 250 metres, it's an intricate piece of work in red-coloured pencil, which Pio began after repeatedly seeing an artefact that forms part of the Ashmoleans' founding collection.
And it's a deer-hide skin robe that was given by Chief Powhatan, who was, I guess, more famously known as Pocahontas' father. But this ceremonial robe was given to the first British boats that arrived on the shores of Virginia. And I managed to get access to images of the back of this mantle, and I went about drawing the back of it. And in that process, it kind of stopped becoming a mantle or stopped becoming an object, but became this map of a land that doesn't exist. Maybe in my head, it's a map to lands that were never allowed to exist, lands that were lost, lands that were under siege, lands that were taken. And so using it as a starting point to talk about very specific histories of dispossession, it almost becomes like an atlas for the rest of the exhibition.
In a way, each item that Pio's made, or the artefacts that he's chosen to display, act as atlases to the historical forces that bring art and artefacts into museums. And during his time at the Ashmolean, he stumbled upon two items that trace history's uncanny echoes. That resulted in the work for the Sphinx, two tiaras held up by small metal rods sitting atop two large plinths. The originals are meant to fit a pair of lead Sphinx sculptures sitting at Oxford's Blenheim Palace.
These Sphinx sculptures bear the likeness of the Duchess of Marlborough, a woman named Gladys Deacon, who ends up with these tiaras because in the 1920s, these tiaras entered London from Russia. And this tiara is famously known as the Kokoshnik tiara because it was one of the favorite pieces of jewelry of the last Romanov empress.
You might know how that story ended. The Romanovs were exiled, but mostly executed, and the Soviet state later seized their ornate assets.
And so Stalin then collaborates with Christie's to sell the jewelry along with this tiara in London, where it ends up on the head of Gladys Deacon.
But the story of these tiaras doesn't end in London.
When Gladys Deacon dies, it goes back to auction, and in 1977, it's purchased by Imelda Marcos.
Yep, so that same Romanov tiara eventually made it to Hawaii in nappies, only to be sent back to the Philippines, where it now sits in the vaults of the central bank in Manila.
Thinking about history, for me, it's always been about an intimacy with events and objects. I think we always consider history as something larger than ourselves. But in this exhibition, history is literally embodied by things that relate to the body. So I think ultimately what I want people to take away from this exhibition is to really understand history according to their own dimensions, not something that is much larger than themselves, but something that is embodied by their very presence in the gallery.
Pio Abad speaking to Alan Whedon. The winner of this year's Turner Prize will be announced tomorrow at Tate Britain. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Tari Stiastny and Simon Brooke. The show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer and Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.